The Economist.
Hello and welcome to The Intelligence from The Economist. I'm Rosie Blore.
And I'm Jason Palmer. Every weekday, we provide a fresh perspective on the events shaping your world.
Fruit flies may not seem like the most complex of characters, but now, for the first time, we have a full map of the fly brain. And that incredible achievement may also help us understand the human one.
And the way things are going, we should all get used to talking sense into people taken by wild conspiracy theories. If you've never tried it, it ain't as easy as it should be. Good news, though, we can get some tips from very successful chatbots. But first,
we will fix our public services, we will stabilise our economy, and we will do it quickly, because we don't want any of the problems associated with our inheritance misting up the shop window of Britain.
On Monday, I attended the British government's International Investment Summit, convened by British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer.
Matthew Holhouse is The Economist's British political correspondent.
The British government at least can still throw something of a party after a day of speeches by ministers, after panel appearances by execs from Alphabet and BlackRock. Eric Schmidt, the former boss of Google, was there. They're all whisked off to St. Paul's Cathedral, where they were greeted by King Charles. They listened to Elton John, the musician, and they were fed by Claire Smith, a Michelin three-star chef.
We've also got to look at regulation across the piece. And where it is needlessly holding back the investment, we need to take our country forward.
In his address, Sir Keir Starmer made his pitch to investors that he would use the strong hand of the state to sweep away obstacles to growth.
We will rip up the bureaucracy that blocks investment. We will march through the institutions and make sure that every regulator in this country, especially our economic and competition regulators, take growth as seriously as this room does.
But beyond the glitz and the pledges, Britain has some pretty serious problems it needs to solve. On the sidelines of the conference, I spoke to Sir Keir about that.
So you mentioned that Britain has some serious problems. Let's talk about the diagnosis. What are the symptoms?
Britain has a productivity problem which really underpins its poor public services and its poor growth in living standards. So real wages have really grown pretty slowly since the financial crisis of 2008. And in the view of the Labour government, this really lies at the root of public unhappiness and distrust of politicians. And the root of this, in their view, is low public and private sector investment. So the UK has been at the bottom of the group of 7 for the last 24 of the past 30 years in terms of public and private investment, according to the Institute for Public Policy Research, a think tank which is relatively close to Downing Street. Really, at the heart of the government's objectives yesterday was about increasing private sector investment, which they hope eventually feeds through to productivity and living standards.
But what does that look like, though? What's the course of treatment?
So the first element of Starmer's pitch really is the promise of a normalisation of relations between business and government after the pretty choppy years following the European Union referendum, basically wanting to restore policy predictability and stability for investors. And he claims that because he won a big majority in the general election of July, he now has that stability. He can make plans, he says, that will last years rather than months. The second limb of this pitch is an attempt really to make Whitehall rather less baffling and Byzantine for investors by creating a so-called concierge service.
I do want a central place where investors can go and say, right, this is the door through which I walk. I don't have to negotiate every bit of government on my own every single time, which can be a real frustration, particularly
So the Office for Investment, which is a government unit, will be enlarged and wired better into number 10, into the business department, into the Treasury. It's going to be led by Poppy Gustafsson, who is a former tech boss. She was CEO of Darktrace and has been made investment minister by Sir Keir. And the idea is that investors will really only have to go to one place in government to get everything they need in terms of grants or visas or planning permissions.
But in the context of what Sir Keir said in his speech, ripping up bureaucracy, marching through institutions, I mean, what does that mean in practice?
So some elements are clearer than others. Somewhere where we're getting a pretty clear picture of where he wants to go is on the planning system, which is really latched onto as a major obstacle to investment. And this really, a big part of Labour's diagnosis is on the so-called fundamentals of the economy in terms of housing, transport and energy, all of which encounter pretty difficult obstacles in terms of getting planning permission. There's going to be a really big focus from the government on making it easier to build housing on so-called brownfield land.
Particularly for urban housing, we need to get to a position where there's a default position of, yes, we can move forward at pace. But for all projects, I want there to be confidence that the planning rules will be simpler, faster, and that even if it's a no, it's a quick no, not a slow no.
There is going to be a government bill on this. The contents are still very much in development, but we have a direction of travel, I think. What was interesting yesterday is that his rhetoric really indicated an ambition to take on broader bits of Britain's regulatory landscape and a real sort of scepticism about the effectiveness of some of the UK's economic regulators.
But at the moment, there's too much regulation and it's inconsistent. Different regulatory bodies are sort of pulling in different directions. They're not closely aligned enough, in my view, with the strategic aims of government.
So all of that sounds relatively sensible. This is about stopping the political somersaults. It's about rationalising Whitehall. It's about taking on some of these really obvious problems with the planning system, which governments have known need to be addressed for years, but have frequently found it quite hard to do because of the composition of their electoral coalition. What's quite interesting about Sir Keir and the current Labour leadership is that they fuse these ideas of supply-side reform, which sometimes sound almost Thatcherite, with elements of policy prospectus, which is much more to the left, and certainly more so than governments have been for 40 years or so.
Well, much more to the left is what you might have expected with a Labour government. What's the sort of meat and potatoes on the left side of all this?
So the most striking element is in terms of labour market and employment reform. For 40 years or so, really, since Thatcher and then through the Blair and Brown years and into the Conservative governments, British governments have advertised Britain's labour market, which is relatively liberal by international standards, as a draw for investors. It's relatively easy to hire people and it is in relative terms easy to let them go. This government is going in the opposite direction.
The better protection of people at work is a really important component of growth. And every good business knows that. Good businesses know invest in your people capital because that way productivity goes up.
So on October the 10th, the government published an employment rights bill of pretty striking breadth. It focuses both on individual rights, so for example, better protecting people from harassment at work or giving people rights that kick in on the day one of their employment, but also focusing on what is called sort of collective rights. So the ability of trade unions to organise in the workplace, the ability of trade unions to initiate industrial action.
So yes, this is an economic argument for the betterment of the country to make people better off, but it is also a fight for the values of freedom and democracy that we fundamentally believe in.
Now, Starmer's argument for this has two legs. One is he says, this is about productivity. This is about doing the things that good employers already do. We don't want to have a precarious, low-wage economy. This is about encouraging the creation of good jobs. The second limb of this argument, which is slightly newer, is he argues that this is one response to the populist mood, which across the rich world is threatening stable democracies, but also threatening the values of openness on which investors depend.
So a real mix, as you say, of left and right, of high-minded and quite granular. What's your takeaway from all this?
What was apparent in opposition and is really manifesting in government is Labour's relationship with investors is something of a quid pro quo. So on one side of the ledger, Sir Keir Starmer says he can offer policy predictability, he can promise a less Byzantine Whitehall, and he's offering supply side reform, particularly in terms of the planning system. On the other half of this quid pro quo is he expects businesses to comply with a more tightly regulated labour market. And this is the thing that was really sort of hanging over the summit yesterday, to pay an increased tax burden, because we know that there is going to be a budget on October 30th, and all the signalling out of the government is that that is going to imply tax increases. Now, the government has ruled out taxes on what they call working people, so effectively income taxes, taxes on sales of goods. So that points to other measures of raising revenue, potentially around capital gains tax, potentially on private equity. It's a pretty fine balancing act. On the one hand, if he delivers planning reform of the radicalism which he describes, then that could potentially be quite transformational. On the other hand, his labour market reforms really do risk denting what has long been a calling card for investors, and they need to be very, very careful at the budget that they do not effectively end up militating against everything he said yesterday in terms of attracting investment. It is a very, very careful balancing act that he has to strike.
Matthew, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
Ever since we humans became conscious of our own brains, we've wanted to know more about them, how they work, how they make us work, how they make us human. But the human brain is notoriously complex. With 86 billion neurons, it's often described as the most complicated object in the known universe. To try and understand it, we need to start smaller, much smaller. So for the first time, scientists have now mapped the brain of a fruit fly.
This isn't something that's arrived out of the blue. An understanding of the fly nervous system has been building up for decades. This is the zenith of the thing.
Jeff Carr is one of our senior editors.
There are 140,000 neurons in a fruit fly's brain, which is quite a lot, and to build a 3D map, you have to use electron microscopy. You slice a fly's brain into very thin slices, and then you run a beam of electrons through them and take a photograph at the other side. With each of the slices, you lay them on top of each other, work out the connections between them, and if you have clever enough artificial intelligence, which we do these days, you can make a 3D image of the fly's brain with all the connections in it, of which there turn out to be more than 50 million.
And is this the first time that a brain has been mapped in this way?
Quite a long time ago, back in the 1990s, a very simple worm called C. elegans had its entire nervous system mapped because it doesn't have a brain. But that was only 300 nerve cells, 300 neurons. And there is also a map of a fly grub, the simplest larva that comes out of the egg, which has 3,000 neurons. There's also a partial map of a fly brain that came out about 3 or 4 years ago. But this is the first time that a map has been made of what I would call a complex animal that can do stuff. It can fly around, obviously. It can flirt with its sexual partners. They can fight. They can even do things like warning each other about dangers. And these are probably all reflex actions rather than what we would describe as conscious thought. But nevertheless, it's a fairly sophisticated animal.
And what will it help us understand?
It should, with a bit of luck, help us understand how brains work. This is a little complex because brains evolved originally when animals became long and thin, became worm-like, and you need a cluster of nerve cells to run the sense organs and tell the body what to do as a response. That's a brain. The first of those animals, we reckon, was 600 or 700 million years ago. Very early on in the history of those animals, they divided into two groups. Most animals are on one side of that divide, and those include flies, but a few of them, which include the vertebrates, are on the other side of the divide. So it's quite possible, likely even, that brains evolved independently twice, and the fly's brain may have very little to do in a deep evolutionary sense with the brains that led to human brains. It means that you can compare two different sorts of ways of doing things and learn more about what is and isn't possible with neural nets.
When you say it means you can compare two different ways of doing things, what do you mean by that?
So nerve cells communicate with each other with chemicals called neurotransmitters, and they tend to have the same sorts of roles in different brains, but there's a neurotransmitter called glutamate, which works in one way in fly brains and in completely the opposite way in a mammalian brain. In one case, they are stimulants, in one case, they're suppressants. And also the architecture of a fly brain is completely different. So that can tell you different ways that a brain can work. But on the other hand, there are lots of similarities about how the brain cells connect.
So you say this will help us understand the evolution of brains. Will it also be the first step to mapping these more complex brains?
Definitely. I mean, one of the most significant things about this is it's been done at all. The project itself, which was organised by some researchers at Princeton University in America, in New Jersey, it's part of a wider American government thing called the BRAIN Project, with BRAIN spelled out in capital letters. Very unoriginal. But the purpose is to develop technology to look at brains. If you can make a fly connect tone, the next one which people want to look at is mice, because they're also widely used experimental animals and they're mammals, so they're much more similar to us. Now, the people who are involved in this reckon that if they were given $1 billion in 10 years, they could do it with a mouse brain. For comparison, the Human Genome Project took $3 billion and also 10 years. So it's probably doable. And then after that, you make the technology better and go on to the bigger human brain.
Jeff, clearly the end point here is the human connectome. What will we understand when we get that map of the human brain?
I think there's a very good chance we'll understand how brain diseases we call psychiatric work, things like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, where they're not like organic diseases like Alzheimer's, where you can easily see the physical cause. In psychiatric illnesses, it's probably down to the wiring between the brain cells. So if you can look exactly at the wiring between the brain cells, you can probably work out what's going on. And that would help you, I imagine, to treat people who have those conditions. The other thing which intrigues me is that it's possible we would find the physical traces of what it means to be human and why human beings are such extraordinarily different animals in certain aspects from everybody else. We might be able to look at the brains of great apes and see something that we very patently have got that they haven't. And that might tell us why we are, how we are.
Fascinating stuff. Jeff, thanks so much for talking to me.
And thank you. Pleasure.
On my reporting trips throughout the South, I meet people who believe in a wild array of things. Some of them are these dizzying conspiracy theories that feel hard to understand.
Rebecca Jackson is our Southern correspondent.
I recently came across a study that said that AI chatbots could help convince people out of them. And I thought that I'd just try and get into the minds of some of these people that I meet. So here, I'm just going to open up ChatGPT, and I'm going to pretend that I hold a conspiracy theory. I'm going to tell it that I believe that COVID-19 vaccines have tracking microchips in them that were implanted by Bill Gates. And then maybe I'll ask, is that true? Okay, let's see what it says. The chatbot says, no, that claim is not true. There's no evidence to support the idea that COVID-19 vaccines contain microchips or that they were created to track individuals. This conspiracy theory has been debunked by scientists and health organizations. But can you give me some data to prove your point? I don't believe you. Okay, it's giving me bullet points. It says, I understand there can be lots of conflicting information out there, especially from trusted figures. Here are some key points and credible sources that might help clarify. And it seems kind of friendly. It says that if you're interested in exploring these sources or have specific questions, I'd be happy to help guide you. I'm not sure if this would fully convince me if I believe that COVID-19 vaccines were really bad, but the chatbot does bring up some compelling points.
So, Becca, tell me about this study.
The study is from a trio of researchers at MIT and Cornell University. They recruited 2,200 self-declared conspiracy theorists in America, and they had them sit down in front of ChatGPT-4 for a series of conversations with them about these beliefs that they held to be true.
So what happened? What did they do?
Basically, sort of like what I was just doing. So they'd sit down in front of the chatbot and they'd explain their conspiracy theory and provide some data that they believed backed it up. For example, one subject claimed that the federal government had orchestrated the attacks on September 11th in 2001, and that the jet fuel from the crash was not actually hot enough to melt the steel girders supporting the Twin Towers. But then the bot would counter them, and in this case, it sounded like a cool-headed science teacher. Here's what it had to say. It said that the temperatures that jet fuel burns at are below the melting point of steel, but that the argument sort of misrepresents the situation's physics. It says that in order to lose structural integrity, the steel doesn't actually need to be that hot, and it begins to weaken much earlier. By the end of the conversation, this subject, her self-reported confidence in the theory fell by 60%.
And presumably they tried this with a range of conspiracy theories.
They did, Rosie. So everything from COVID-19 to the 2020 election, aliens, the moon landing, and the death of Princess Diana. They found that on average, these short conversations decrease people's confidence in the conspiracy by 20%. And the effect actually persisted until the end of the study 2 months later.
I've had the same experience as you, Becca, where I've tried to persuade someone of something that they're saying that seems to have no basis in reality. So do we know why it worked?
The researchers tested a couple different theories. First, they looked at whether it could just be about tone, right? Rosie, when you're talking to someone who you disagree with, you might get angry or frustrated, and that might lead to a tone that's not particularly conducive to convincing someone that you're right. In the first study, they asked the chatbot to be courteous and polite and kind and say things like, I completely understand that you feel that way. And in the second, they didn't. They just presented the facts. And it turns out that the results didn't change at all. So tone does not seem to have mattered. Instead, the researchers attribute the success of the chatbots to just having a vast amount of information that they can call upon instantaneously. Conspiracy theorists tend to come to arguments armed with huge amounts of data because, after all, they've usually researched these things rather extensively. And so the person that they're talking to is usually kind of at a loss for defending their arguments. The chatbot evens the playing field because it can draw on just as much information, if not more, than the human that it's talking to.
Isn't the problem, though, Becca, that a lot of people who believe in conspiracy theories never even question them?
That's a great point. And given the amount of polarization that there is, at least in America, people are siloed into worlds in which many people believe what they believe, and they aren't even engaging these conversations. But until now, we haven't really even had a tool that could convince people. And so the fact that this exists, at least to those who are fighting conspiracy theories and fighting against misinformation and disinformation, it feels at least a bit hopeful.
Becca, thanks so much for talking to me.
Thanks for having me on, Rosie.
That's all for this episode of The Intelligence. We'll see you back here tomorrow.